Okay, afternoon everybody. Thank you, Toby. Yep, that's me. I've got half an hour to talk about quite a lot of work that we've been doing over the last, going on for 2 years, so it's a bit whistle-stop. Really the purpose of this is to talk about what we've learned from a series of prototypes that we've been running, not just in terms of the nuts and bolts of the work, but what we've learned systemically, both in terms of things that we think have worked, but also what it's telling us about things in the wider system that need attention. The thing about prototyping is, in one sense, it's pretty easy. You can create a totally artificial environment and then ask people to work differently within it, and then that gives you a crucible to develop practices. What that does, though, is you have to be very careful, because if something works, it's not a simple matter of saying, well, let's just do that everywhere. By creating that artificial environment, you will have had to have done something to allow certain things to happen, what I would call a countermeasure. So, for example, we might say, we're going to give some people some money to spend that they wouldn't normally have. And that might give you an opportunity to learn something. It's not just a case then of translating that everywhere. We've got to think about, what is that telling us about the system? So the kind of spoiler alert for this is, it told us quite a few things about what commissioning would need to do. What it didn't do is tell us how to do it. So that's the next step. So this is continuous learning. This isn't an end point. So we've done some tests, we've done some trials, and we've learned a bunch of things. I'll tell you about those, and it'll be interesting to see what you make of them. This isn't by any means a formula for anything. So I'll just explain a little bit about these prototypes. We've run one completed and two have nearly finished. We wanted to try and understand what would happen if you kind of took as much off the table as possible in terms of current commitments to things and focus on a single purpose, which is helping people to thrive. Sounds very lovely, but we wanted to turn it into something pragmatic. So we've got two problems, I suppose, or it's two sides of the same problem in Gateshead that we want to tackle. The first is an enormous and increasing amount of inequality, of opportunity, and of resources and in life. And the other thing, very, very much focused more from the council point of view, and other agencies will have this too, is that we've got an increasing squeeze on our resources. So how can we deal with increasing inequality and a reduction in our resources? Well, one of the things when you study the gap between what money we think we'll need and the money that we have, and will have, is that about 60% of the gap going forward is money that we'll have never had. So it's what we think is going to get more. So cutting won't cut it, because you can't cut what you've never had. So if demand's going up, and costs are going up, particularly if demand's going up, we need to get demand down. So cutting services isn't going to reduce demand. We need to have another method. How do we reduce demand? So where this work comes into its own purpose is that we wanted to cut demand by increasing the amount of people that were thriving. The more people that thrive, demand goes down. How might we do that? So we decided to run a test for 6 months, and we decided to start somewhere where we felt there were some signals of people that maybe weren't thriving. And as a council, we've got access to all sorts of information and data. So we decided to start with debt, specifically with council tax debt. So we looked at the long list of people that owed us money. And we looked at the means by which we typically collect that money. And what we typically do is we will send letters, and then we'll send a bailiff round. And we've got no context around that debt. We just know that we're owed the money, and it's our duty to collect it. And it is our duty to collect it. So what we did instead is we set up a small team of 4 people, and we gave them complete sort of freedom as long as they stuck to certain rules, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. And we just asked them to ring people up and say, look, we can see you've got a debt. How are you and how is everything? Interestingly, about 5 or 6 occasions, people thought it was a hoax call and would ring this council up and say, I've had a hoax call from somebody trying to be helpful. We said, no, that was us. So we had to tell customer services that it was real. I'm only being slightly flippant, and it's true, but it illustrated something of a point. People were in a position to not really have us call them. And we decided that we would just get to know people, and we would see what would happen if we got to know them and tried to help them with whatever problems they had. So we learned this. we learned three big things which I think matter to commissioners. We learned in doing that if we keep it bespoke, it's much more likely to be effective and therefore much more likely to cost less money. There's some caveats on that, which I'll come on to in a bit. But broadly speaking, Toby alluded to this, if everything you do is based on a bespoke, good relationship, the chances are you're wasting very little. The other thing that we learned is that when we looked at what the current system does, the wider health and wellbeing system, no particular bit of it, we found that support was the main thing that was missing. I'll elaborate on that in a bit, but broadly speaking, when somebody presents with something or has a need, there are three ways you can respond. You can transact, you can support, or you can intervene, and the middle one is the one where we seem to be struggling, and there are reasons for that, which I'll come on to. It's not absent, it's just there's less of it than there needs to be. I should make that point. And the third thing was that there's been lots of talk over the years about person-centred this, person-centred that, and I don't think it's a bad thing. But what we learned through this approach is that the relationship between the person out there and the person working with them was the thing to base this on. Because if there's a relationship, there's more to be learned, there's more understanding of context. If it's person-centred, then we're expecting the person themselves to know a lot more about what they want. Often they'll know what matters, but they won't be able to, they'll feel pressured if you say, what do you want? But they'll be able to tell you what they're worried about. And it requires a relationship to eke that knowledge into a solution. It's a subtle but important difference. And again, I'll elaborate as we go through. So some caveats on that first thing about bespoke public services, more effective and therefore cheaper. That is particularly important. When context matters, it's really important. So if we're talking about very standard, high volume, low complexity things, then there is an argument for some form of standardisation. I'll come on to that in a bit. But whenever context is important, whenever any form of complexity, from the sharp end to things that are complex but aren't necessarily difficult, like for example, if somebody's not very good with money but actually everything else is okay, that still requires context. It doesn't require standardised solutions. The notion of it being more effective is down to whether the citizen thinks so, not us. We can sign things off for commissioners and say tick, or for whomever and say tick, but it has to be measured by the person that it's for, which sounds rather obvious, but again, it exists in the system that we can see good where a citizen sees less than good. And the big cost caveat is this is the cost across the whole system. So something bespoke might cost some of you more than it costs you now, but it might cost us all less. But we're structurally it's very difficult to reconcile that, but we have to if we've got a chance of sustaining any of this work. Because if we don't try to do that, this work it will die. And finally, and the same goes for demand. Demand into some services might go up if you do bespoke work, but it will fall off in other areas. So how do we actually, if that's the right thing to do, how do we design for doing that? So I stand by the statement, but there are some caveats. So let's just talk a little bit about context. So what we're finding in this work, and I'll come on to some case studies in a moment, is that organisations do a bunch of different things. If they make stuff, then the context is absent, it's irrelevant. So if someone's making a pencil, they don't need to know whether it's going to be used by an artist or by my 5-year-old. They just make the pencil. We can also transact, so the context is incidental but not relevant. So if someone's booking the squash court, then it's because they kind of want to play squash. We can just book the squash court. We're not making anything, but whether they're beginners or experts, it's kind of by the by. And then we can help, or we can solve something where context is really important. And the reason that I'm bringing it up in this way is because we've got different types of organisation and we're conflating things, but I think we shouldn't. So services generally do those two things. They'll help, or they'll solve, or they'll transact. And manufacturing makes stuff. And there's been, ever since the dawn of any form of industrialisation, there's been a long-held assumption that if you standardise stuff, it's a means to efficiency. So if we standardise services, they become efficient. And if you standardise making pins, or making cars, or whatever, then it becomes more efficient. It's certainly true of manufacturing, but it's not true of service. And this is a bit of a heresy. I gave a little heresy lecture a couple of years ago about this very point. Bespoke is more important the more context comes into play. And yet, if we look across the health and well-being, housing, central and local government system, there's a lot of standardisation which is getting in the way. Now you'll notice they're offset, and this is part of the problem, because there are some services where a degree of standardisation is probably a means to efficiency, but they tend to be transactional. So DVLA, for example, taxing your car, very little context required, a tiny bit. So actually what they've done to standardise that is made it much more efficient. But of course when that happened, central government got extremely excited and thought, well, if we can do it for DVLA, we can do it everywhere. So universal credit's problem isn't so much universal credit, it's the digital by default. That's the reason that it's such a potentially punitive system, and it's very difficult to access, because this notion of, well, we standardised that thing and it worked, and it was a digital panacea type approach. We can do that across all of service, but most, if not all, public services require a degree of context. If you try and take standardised approach to that stuff, it doesn't work. It's one size fits no one, and you end up with more demand because people represent. We found that in the people that we helped who had council tax debt, who we approached, 75% of them had been screened out by some service or other across the whole public sector, not just the council, because they either weren't putting the best foot forward or didn't fit a particular eligibility criteria, and yet they were on the cusp of crisis. So if you apply that same logic across there, you end up with an increasing amount of demand. So we need to try to find a way of coming up with bespoke approaches which are sustainable, and that requires us to think differently about how the money works, how the organisational boundaries work, and included in that is commissioning. So I'm just going to talk about a case study, lady whose name isn't Helen, but I'll use that for now. And Helen came to us we're doing a prototype. Sorry, actually, one thing I forgot to mention. There's two other prototypes that are happening now. One is a similar but area-based approach in Bensham, where we're just, again, proactively looking for people who the data tells us that there are potential signals there, and we're helping them. And another one around homelessness, which is based at Basis, which is run by Oasis Community Housing, who, again, we're working with people based on a very bespoke approach to their context, just to see if it makes a difference. So Helen came through actually through the council tax prototype, but after it had finished, there's just some residual work going on. And she's losing a site, and she was a carer at the QE, gave up a job, struggled to manage her finances, and consequently didn't pay her council tax. We sent some letters. She didn't really know what she was eligible for. She didn't really know what help she could get. She'd never had debts before, and she wanted to pay, but was struggling to adapt. Now, the council tax collection system treats people as, the assumption is if you're not paying, it's because you're choosing not to pay. So we send stuff. It gets a bit aggressive, and because losing your sight must be traumatic. That plus everything else meant she, in her words, she was heading for a breakdown. As it turned out, somebody referred her into us, or into the team, and they just did simple stuff. I mean, I'm not going to overplay it. They did the human stuff that Toby talked about before, and they did the learning stuff, and then we tried to make it systemic. So they went to see Helen and just chatted, understood her financial situation and understood her life situation. And then we decoded all the eligibility stuff. And the first thing was first, she needed the money stuff sorted out. And she had a couple of grown-up children who were really struggling as well to help her. And so we just hit pause on everything and said, right, what you can stop now worrying about those letters, and we're going to just see where you are with this. Then restructured the payments. She was actually eligible for some benefits, so DWP came in and sat with her in the house, and they did an end-to-end benefits claim in 40 minutes rather than 6 weeks. And now she pays, and she's now happy to engage with us. She loves the team. She wrote me this letter about the team being guardian angels. The team were a little bit embarrassed. She came in with a card, another letter, and a bottle of gin for the lady that had worked with her. And now she wants to volunteer at the food bank. So I've interviewed her with her permission. I'm going to write something up about that soon. And this, again, this is not just something that the team are capable of. It's just something they're allowed to do. And I know it sounds expensive, but I dread to think where Helen was going to go and how much she was going to cost, frankly. So it isn't any more complicated than that. So in order for the team to do that, for all these prototypes to do that, we only gave them 2 rules, which was that they had to do no harm and not break the law, and everything else was possible. But we did give them some principles, which were up for grabs if we needed them to be. There were more frameworks than anything else. So we said, we've created an artificial environment for you to learn. So in order for you to learn, we need to start again and not import anything that feels right for us. So we're not going to bring in the assessment things that we're comfortable with. We're going to try and get to know people and understand them more holistically. No matter what your profession is, bring your human side in, talk to people, and if you feel you need more complex, more expertise, pull for it. If you need expertise on losing your sight, pull for somebody that knows about that. So we didn't refer anybody on to somebody else. We kept it, but we wanted to bring people in that could help us. We didn't assume we knew everything that we needed to know. The team are allowed to make the decisions, not me, not anybody else. And the citizen that we were trying to help, they decided how far the work went. We had one case, one lady in the first prototype, where the answer, frankly, was dog grooming, believe it or not. And we only knew that because we got to know her. And again, so many people that are hamstrung by bits of the system, they know how to do this. You know, we do not have a skills problem. We've just got a design problem. So they're the rules and principles that we used. And to me, that's critical, because my message for commissioners would be, if you can create an environment where that is a tick in the box for what we're paid, what success looks like, how we fund work, then it enables us potentially to solve a lot more problems and reduce a lot more demand. So that's what we're aiming for. Excuse me. I've got a bit of a cold, so if I break up, I apologise in advance. The other thing that we learned, and I alluded to this before, is that support is kind of missing. One of the things that's happened over the last 9 years, without wishing to politicise this, is that we can't cut and shouldn't be cutting overly the intervention stuff at the extreme end, because rightly, we get that right, that's high stakes stuff, the statutory stuff. And at the other end of the need spectrum, if you like, the stuff that's transactional, repeatable, it has an attraction. We want to do things as cheaply as possible, so we try to invest in those, but the stuff in the middle we struggle with. So just to illustrate that point a bit, when we looked at all the various nearly 200 people now that have been through the 3 prototypes, we kind of recast what we thought we were seeing in terms of level of need. And we've borrowed this and adapted it from the early help strategy. So we saw there was a group of people actually that they could self-serve and self-navigate. They could either turn up or do it online, or know who to speak to about their problem, and then they'll go and speak to somebody else about their other problem, and they were content in that. I'll just be interested, put your hand up when you think complexity starts. So the next one is people that are in it, like council tax, universal service. It's applicable to everybody, but we can see signals in there that maybe there's a future need for something else. Somebody who might be not great with money, but everything else might be okay, they still need a bespoke approach. It just might be a bespoke approach that it takes half an hour. We had some cases in the council tax prototype. They were in the minority. I think we had about 6, where the main problem was financial. Everything else was okay. So what we did is we put somebody from council tax or from benefits with them for a couple of visits and got everything straightened out, and then they were done. But that sounds, well, obviously, but the reality is they will have been seen purely through the lens of their council tax debt, not their financial situation, which meant that they would have probably ignored that, and it would have ended up creating a whole bunch of other problems. And we know this because some of the people that were further up had ignored it and were starting to demonstrate other behaviours, loan sharks, for example. So there are all sorts of issues around. Bespoke needs to be a lot earlier than it is now. Then obviously we could see people where it wasn't a signal of potential need, it was an actual need, and again this is a phrase borrowed from the early help capability of the council. So they talk about emerging and escalating needs, but they're still not at that kind of statutory bit yet, but it's kind of in the post. And then at the far end you've got very complex, very difficult, requiring of specialist input, and then really quite grave, difficult stuff at that end. Which I don't, that's not my expertise at all, but clearly you can see that as a human being. And what's significant about the work we did, and when we tried to reframe what we were looking at, is that those different types of responding, whether it's transacting or having to kind of intervene or supporting, all had different relevance here. And it basically meant that you could try different methods out at different times, and what we wanted to do was focus in that middle arc, the light green and the yellow, because we felt that's where, and learned that that's where the most difficulty was. Critical to this work was the fact that, again, not the greatest way of putting it, but I can't think of a better way. You kind of need to be this bad, quote unquote, in order to get somebody to get to know you, to understand your context, and to be your caseworker, if you like, even if it's people that need 2 hours worth of debt advice. But you tend to be transacted with, not supported, all the way through to being this bad, or nearly this bad. There are exceptions, but by and large, that's the CARE Act, I would suggest. So here you've got experts who are hard-pressed trying to deal with a lot of problems, and if we're going to solve that problem around reducing demand such that by people thriving, more needs to happen here, but austerity has cut this stuff because it was easy to cut. Cheap, statutory, cuttable, therefore cut. So assertive outreach type services and various other things have really struggled, and it's been lots of difficult decisions. But it's created an influx of more demand into that higher end. So what we're really trying to understand is, well, what does this arc need to have in it? And the prototypes have helped us understand that. We've developed a role called a community caseworker, which picks up and runs with relationships from this point onwards. And it essentially does work, because what we find is 75% of the people that have been through this process have told us that they are in a better place than they were at the start. I mean, it's got a lot of road to run, because some of these things are going to take a while to solve. And the final point is around that this notion of person-centred. I'm not saying it's bad, but we're finding of a lot of the people that aren't yet at that statutory end, but are in that middle grouping, we're finding that the relationship between the caseworker and the citizen is a real asset here, because it's a bit of pushback. It's not give everybody everything they want. It's not as laissez-faire as that. It's about saying, well, it's also about being challenging. We had a couple of instances where somebody was benefiting from it. They had relatively low level of need, but they did need a bespoke approach, and they were chancing their arm and all the stuff you worry about. But because a relationship had been formed, the team were able to say and grow into this, no, that's not proportionate. Or this is a new thing. What's happening here? So they'd be able to develop a relationship which allowed two-way challenge, and it built trust. So, and critical to this is the fact that when we looked at the people presenting, or that we went to see who had debt problems, it was, I think, only about 10% of them, the debt was the main problem. And if we weren't forming relationships, we wouldn't have learned that. So what we found is that relationships beat transactions hands down. And if we form a relationship that's based on trust and agency, then we can understand whether or not the signal that we're seeing is actually the problem, or whether it's a consequence of something else. So is the debt the problem, or is it actually to do with, and so many variations. So one lady, the reason she had a debt was because she had to give up one of her 2 jobs, and the reason she had to give up one of her 2 jobs is because she couldn't get childcare at night, and the reason she needed it, and rather than her mum come round, is that they had a violent neighbour that the mum was scared of, and on it went. So ultimately we ended up solving a housing problem so that we can solve a debt problem, so that we can get somebody back into work and help the child before the child's behaviour starts to deteriorate further. So that was a relationship that did that. It wasn't a transaction. One of the things that was really interesting, the team talked a lot, they used the word reset. I'm learning still, but what we found is that people that weren't at that far end, but were definitely requiring some sort of bespoke help, often talked about the need to reset, whether it's finances, whether it's somewhere new to live, whether it's relationships. It was a common thing to people just want to help clean the place up. The idea that somebody was empathising and building a relationship rather than transacting and going through eligibility gave people pause. And when they had pause, they would often say, can you help me clean up? I just want to kind of start again. So that notion of resetting, we have to ask ourselves, and perhaps commissioners have to ask, is that something worth investing in as opposed to dealing with what happens if we don't? It might seem flippant, but it seemed to work. So all I'm imparting is what we think we've learned. Same with bills and paperwork. A very common thing we found with people in debt is they had carrier bags full of unopened letters. It's really common. So we would sit down and we'd go through them. And then we'd hit reset where we could, and we'd come up with a different plan. It was never as bad as they thought it was going to be when those letters were opened. Never. But they couldn't do it. They needed that reset help. And also reconnecting to society, community, and I should add in there family. Sometimes one of the things the team found themselves doing is resolving grudges. And they were really damaging people's lives. It was fascinating. So really, to do this, we need to default to probing rather than punishing, because one of the things I must talk about here is we've inadvertently created some problems and made a punitive system. There's one lady who, because she hadn't attended or responded to 3, I think it was, letters or calls, just screened out of services. And if anything, that not responding was a signal that we needed to do something rather than a justification to not do something. Consequently, it got a lot worse, and then actually we were unable to deal with it. So there's something, I know that creates tensions and it creates resource problems, but it is what we learned. Also, we found that when cases were closed, when people represented, it was almost like we'd never met them before. So hibernation was something that the team were talking about. So even if we can close a case, we have to ask ourselves, should we? Have we really got to the bottom of this? Are they content that this might be the end of what they're eligible for, but is it the end? So somehow commissioning for context seems to be the key here. So a commissioner might say to provider, demonstrate to me that you understand the context of the people you're helping, rather than show me how many you did. So if you do probe, you find out whether people are trapped or tangled, and some of you have heard this before, I know, and I'm not going to go too much into this, but we found that 85% of the people that we worked with were tangled. That is that they had a lot of problems, but none of the problems on their own was enough to completely derail them. It was the accumulation. So opening the bag full of letters, reconnecting with the neighbour, cleaning the place or helping them clean the place. These things pulled away at those threads until they were able to sort of pick it up and run with it. That is a lot of what you're dealing with pre-Care Act, through pre-statutory. But we're not commissioning for that. At least I don't think we are. And 15% were the trapped ones, where they were tangled as well, but there was one issue that solve that and you solve it. Untangle all the other issues, irrelevant. So 5 out of 6, it was mental health, something we couldn't deal with. So what we found in the trapped cases, I'm not going to go through that one. Actually, I will slightly, because one point I want to make that Toby talked about earlier on, came up in the questioning. The question came about self-sabotage. I can't remember who asked the question, but if somebody self-sabotages based on what we're trying to do, then in trying to understand and rebalance them to get them to a point of stability, we would say, well, we haven't finished the understand bit. There's no stability there. So we can't think about maintenance. We can't think about can we stop or close. That would tell me, it's reframing, I think, as Gary said. No, we're still in that cycle, so we haven't done it yet. So now I've gotten pressed for time. So all I would say with the tangled people is that listening to the team in debrief, what they're telling me is that they were dealing with the urgent before they were dealing with the important. So they weren't searching for the root cause and ignoring all the symptoms, saying, oh, you know, symptoms are just, let's get to the root cause. They would take the symptoms seriously. I'm hungry or I'm skint. And in dealing with that, because they had money, so they could get them a bit of a food shop and help them out, get them over a bit of a hump, that built the trust for them to say, well, the reason I'm skint is because I'm lonely or I'm scared or I won't leave the house because of X. And then we're into how do we prevent future demand by solving problems and helping people to thrive. It also, interestingly, exposes, we give people the benefit of the doubt, and on a very, very small minority of cases, dealing with the urgent revealed that there were people that were kind of just trying to get as much out of us as they could, in which case the team had the confidence to say no. Which sounds wasteful, but it's less wasteful than not going through this process and losing people and then them coming back when they're worse. So, essentially, dealing with the urgent before dealing with the important was critical to the Tangled people, and it showed that caseworking should start way earlier than it does now. Right now, you've got people hard-pressed at that far end who are having to have big caseloads and deal with acute problems, but we're not taking that same ethos early enough in that spectrum of need. To help the people out at that end, we need to be doing it earlier. But the good news is we've got the people already. We had people from the CAB, from DWP, and from the council and the housing company that were all equally adept at doing casework. They've all got the skills because they're all human beings, to pick up Toby's point. So how can we contractually do that? Because the commonsensical stuff isn't common practice. We're having to derail, get in our own way, derail ourselves sometimes. How do we change that? And just finally, for the trapped people that we couldn't help, we fought for them, but we couldn't really do much. I mean, our most difficult case is now finally in a place of safety and is likely to be there for a couple of years. But I'm not going to go into that one, it's too much. But suffice to say, we didn't solve our most difficult case, we didn't solve the problem. But we didn't give up either, and it just meant fighting when the system isn't perfect. You've got to keep that advocacy going. So until the system's perfect, then we're going to have to almost commission for the ability to stick up for people, even if we're not quite sure what to do. That sounds really unscientific, but it's all we've got until we can fix other parts of the system. So overall lessons, just quickly. This approach of providing teams of caseworkers that are working way before the statutory space does work for lots of tangled people, and you can be tangled really early on in that space. If you don't untangle then, you're either untangling more or you're into the statutory bit and they've got enough going on as it is, with far fewer resources than before. It doesn't work well for the trapped, but it does shine light on the problem, and that's incumbent upon us all to fix. We do have the people and the skills, but we don't have the frameworks to do the prevention through support stuff that's in the middle of that arc. We need to work on that. We need to support the people in the statutory services a lot more than we're doing as an ecosystem. So don't buy outcomes, as Toby said. Invest in relationships that can solve problems. So if I'm a commissioner, I'd love to be able to turn up to a provider and say, show me how you're learning, show me how you're improving, rather than, have you done this, this, and this? That's the dynamic that reflects complexity that we encountered and challenged with Toby's work. Other points of leverage, other things that we need to do that are not this, but are linked to this, and they're important. When we asked the team what made it difficult to do the right thing, they would say things like, people want to help us, but the regulatory stuff gets in the way. So how can regulators actually help us? We need to look at that. We need to look at the data to see, well, which doors do we knock on? Because the council tax signal was a damn good one. What others are there? Because why do we have to wait until people show up or are in crisis? What other clues have we got, and how can we be proactive? The bespoke approach does require us to work in partnership. As I think we demonstrated, all of those partners are equally adept. So why don't we reflect that in how we operate? And critically, this is a leadership issue. This requires us to think differently about control, money, hierarchy, remit. And it also requires national leadership to kind of rethink how they inspect us and to work with us rather than possibly working against us. I'm not going to do that because I haven't got time. So I'll just leave you with that slide because I think that's the key one. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much.